I am interviewing Lan Cao and her daughter, Harlan Van Cao. And Harlan is a senior at Ocean View. She's just about to graduate in about a week and a half. So thank you so much for taking time out of your day, both of you guys, to talk to us. And Lan Cao, Harlan's mom, is an author of a couple books. And so I read Monkey Bridge and The Lotus in the Storm, and they were amazing books about the Vietnam War. And this is why we're here today, is to talk about the Vietnam War, as well as your experience in coming to the United States from Vietnam, and as well as your relationship with Harlan and how that experience has shaped your relationship and so on. Okay, so I'll start with Lan, with you. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and tell us your story?
So I came to the United States in 1975, which is the official end of the war. And my family was actually quite, you would say, divided during the war. Most of the people in my family were in South Vietnam and were in the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, so the South Vietnamese government, allied with the West, right? But I had a Viet Cong uncle whom we were very close to as well. So those political, military, belligerent divisions, family connections, sort of trumped those. So he continued to be a presence in our lives. So as a result, because of the proximity, because there were so many knots and interfaces between the South and the Viet Cong, right? I grew up very knowledgeable, actually, about the war. So it's not as if because you're a kid, you're not as involved and you're just doing your stuff, because those family divisions were synchronized with war divisions. So the war felt like it was very pervasive in the family. And in 75, when the South Vietnam lost the war and collapsed, a lot of people fled. So it was ironic and bitter in many ways, because, you know, one of my observations is that even during the height of the war, which was a long war, and as in most wars, had a lot of violence and deaths, right? Wounded, millions in Vietnam, and 58,000 plus for Americans. To me, it's very bitter and poignant that during that entire period, there were no Vietnamese who fled the country. So after the war, when you had peace, was when you had a massive exodus, right? So it's very clear that people who left were not fleeing violence, because if we had fled violence, we would have fled during the war. So we were part of the group that fled, and I was very lucky because I left in 75, which is, and before the airport shut down. So there was a very interesting movie called Final Days or Last Days in Vietnam that Rory Kennedy made. Right? So when you got closer to the final days, people were scrambling the US Embassy and hanging from helicopters, and it was a much more free-for-all desperation. I left in a much more orderly way before Tan Son Nhut Airport was bombed. But after 75, you know, there was massive exodus of boat people as well. But my departure came in 75, early 75, and I left with an American friend, a family friend, so there are some autobiographical elements that were reflected in the two novels, but the person I left with was an American officer in the US Army, and we had met in 68, and he became a very, very close part of the family. And when his tour of duty was over, he left the US, left Vietnam, returned to the US. And in 75, he returned to Vietnam and basically adopted me, because my parents stayed in Vietnam. So I left with him and grew up for a few months in Connecticut with his wife.
Okay. And What about your parents? When were they able to come to the United States?
They came around May.
Okay, so it was just a few months.
Yes, a few months. So afterward, I left Avon, which was a little town in Connecticut, and went to Virginia to rejoin them. And there were other members of my family who also left, and they ended up in one of the military-built refugee bases, military camps that were converted into refugee housing bases. One was in Fort Chaffee, Arkansas, so that was a very big one. They all were in there. There was another one close by here, Camp Pendleton. There was also a Vietnamese refugee base, and then Fort Indiantown Gap was in Pennsylvania. I think those were the three main ones. But my family was in Fort Chaffee, and most of them, left and resettled basically in Virginia, Northern Virginia, and then some in California.
And so you went to high school in Northern Virginia?
Yes. High
And
school.
what was that?
Sorry?
What was that like?
Well, I would say it's a very horrifying experience for me. For a number of reasons. I think that one, there were so many Vietnamese refugees who arrived and settled in Northern Virginia. For, I think, a convergence of coincidental reasons. It's not like they chose Virginia per se or that one area. I just felt that probably because it was very close to the capital, and in Vietnam, Saigon is safe, so a lot of them wanted to be close to Washington, D.C. So there's a huge, massive infusion of Vietnamese refugees in that area. It's kind of like the equivalent would be like the Syrians coming to Germany when Angela Merkel let them in, right? So the people who live there were just freaking out, like, oh my God, we're invaded in some ways. And second, it was very hard, I think, for a lot of people to see so many from a very unpopular war all coming in one place. So the US policy originally was to disperse the refugees, right? So it was very important that people who were in refugee camps, they could only leave if they were sponsored, right? So it's not like you just left. There had to be a family, like usually a religious group, like a church group, a synagogue group, the Red Cross, somebody who's willing to sponsor you and be responsible for you for a year, right? And so when the government evaluated the sponsorship applications, it was a government policy to make sure that the sponsors came from all over the US, to create a situation, I think, where no one community would sort of bear the brunt of the burden of refugee settlement. But as it turned out, most of the Vietnamese refugees, even though they were sponsored into a very dispersed community, very quickly wanted to, sort of like a magnet, looking like nails looking for a magnet, converged in basically three areas. Houston, Texas usually attracted the people who used to be fisher folks, because there's a vibrant fishing community there. Northern Virginia, a lot of people who were in the government in Vietnam go there. And then, even if your sponsor is from the Dakotas, the Vietnamese would go to Orange County because it's warm. So even though the government tried to disperse, the Vietnamese ended up converging, and that also created like unintended consequences of stress into the local community. So I was in Northern Virginia, where there was a lot of stress points, right? And third, I think it's just very hard, generally, to be an adolescent anyway, and then to be an adolescent in a brand new place, in a different country, everything was different. And it's the 70s, it's not like society has progressed in terms of consciousness, even though we still have more growth to do. The 70s is not the same as 2020. So there were a lot of other kinds of impediments at a place like Jeff Stewart. Like my high school was called Jeff Stewart High School.
Okay.
Yeah, named after the Confederate general too. Yeah, Northern Virginia was surprisingly, even though it's north of Richmond, filled with Confederate markers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so you went to high school, and how was, did you make friends? Did you feel like you were part of the high school experience, or did you feel like you were not a part of anything until college, or?
No friends.
Okay.
And I felt very alienated in high school.
Mm-hmm.
So it was very solitary. And college was much better.
Okay.
I had a lot of problems in high school, but
Mm-hmm.
I very much focused on education because I really saw education as, I always tell Harlan this, it's your way. It's your ticket to anything in this country. And I used high school because I had no friends to sort of analyze American society in a very systematic way, right? I figured out that you have to know the law because it purports to be a country that is based on the rule of law. So it's important to know the laws and to know your rights. And because it's a capitalist country, I wanted to know how the market works. And my specialty now is corporate law, Wall Street, how capitalism works, and what are the laws that facilitate the functioning of market society. So in many ways, because I did not have any social friends or community in high school, it was very sudden. It actually made me focus a lot with like blinders on towards education. I did very well in high school, grade-wise, GPA-wise, SAT-wise, AP-wise, and all of that. And I only had one goal, which is basically the ticket out. And when you're very single-minded, because you are not distracted by friends, social life, not that it was my choice, I had none. It also made it easier to be single-focused. Right? And I turned a lot to books, and so I became very well-read. In high school, my parents had a grocery store, so they were always working. And Saturday and Sunday, I was in the library basically from 9 to 5 and just reading. And in fact, most of my books that I chose to read were English novels and history books, because I noticed there were a lot of books written about the Vietnam War already, and history books. And I also noticed that there was none that took into account any Vietnamese perspective. And I noticed that the absence was not even noticed. That was more interesting to me, right? It's not like it was at a point where you say, oh, look, this is missing. It's so pervasive, the absence was so pervasive that the absence was not even noticed. And I felt that right away in high school. So I always thought I want to write something. But it was more like, a kind of abstract goal. I just sort of fell into writing about it. I never had a plan. It was just more kind of like, this is not right, that there's only one perspective being told, but not a plan to do anything about it. But that just sort of happened. Yeah.
That's interesting. I think that, when I think of writers, I think that they were born writers. And it seems like a lot of people, I was just listening to a book earlier when I was walking, and he said the last thing he ever thought he would do would become a writer. Same thing. He just all of a sudden had a story to tell. So I can kind of segue into, I'll skip ahead to a question I was going to ask later, but you guys have written a book together about your relationship and so forth. Harlan, how did you step into writing to kind of connect to what we were talking about?
I think I always was writing since I was a baby.
just a therapeutic thing by myself. It was never anything dramatic or based on a war like my mother. I think it's because I felt I had a lot to say all the time, and the way I actually got serious about it was because we did this interview with NPR, right? You might have seen it already. And it was meant to show two voices, sort of like the second generation after the war asking the first about it. So I think my mother's publisher heard about it, and then they wanted to see a writing sample of mine. So I sent something in for them, they liked it. And then I think how it works is then you send an outline of how the book would be, like a proposal to try to win them over. But before they had approached us, I had never thought about actually doing it in a way that would like publish it. Or I'd thought about it, but I hadn't really taken the steps because I was 15 when the idea came up. And then it took like another year to finalize it. And then starting junior year, when I actually moved to Ocean View, I had just gotten it. So while I was doing the SATs and then the college tours and everything, I was also writing. And it was really odd to suddenly have it as a job, because I also had an agent and I was doing meetings. We went to New York to meet with Penguin, which was actually kind of daunting for me. I think I had just turned 16. But before that, I had written pages and pages of stuff. The only difference now is that I had to put it under a theme. Like all of my writing now, I had to relate back to my mother. So I would talk about high school in general and other stuff I had written just privately for myself. But then now I had to kind of turn it over to how maybe being raised by this particular mother affected how I went through high school, or how I had like certain friendships. And that's why writing became incredibly like intense for me all of a sudden, because it's not only a job, but then you're also doing it with your mother, and it's also a very heavy topic. And during it, you explore things about the relationship, because it wasn't just about the war itself and the trauma, even though that was the idea. It went a lot deeper into maybe like old baggage that we had. And it also became it was therapeutic, but also very challenging because, for example, if I feel that I want to include something that's relevant, but she feels like she doesn't want it there, or it's sensitive for her, then we have to take it out. Or if the publisher decides it's not like the right thing, then we take it out. So I really learned, I think, early on how difficult it was. And it was hard because usually memoirs, because this one's a memoir, you usually do it at the end of a writing career, but this is like my first time actually coming out as a writer, like published, I guess, in my own book. So that's really difficult too. Is I always thought memoirs were to reflect. And I realized, they asked me to reflect, but I only have 16 years to reflect on. And then when I wrote, I realized I actually had gone through a lot during those 16 years that happened because of my mother and what she had gone through when she was my age. So you really realize from writing, it's such a strong, like, domino effect, I think. Yeah.
We had disagreements, and that's a euphemism to say that it's a disagreement. And I had to call in our agent, who had agented my two other novels. And my agent, her name is Ellen, said, "Oh my God," because she has represented books that are collaborative works that involve two or more. And she said, they're incendiary, even when the two people are just sort of like arm's length colleagues. So when you have this explosive cauldron of pre-existing relationship, and one is an adolescent, I mean, a teenager, just sort of on the cusp of having all kinds of emotional, social, hormonal changes, it adds up to a lot. So she says, it's no surprise that you're going to have little bursts of explosions about disagreements on what you want to write.
Because if we had an original disagreement that was about just like the structure of the book, it could very easily turn into something a lot more personal. And you kind of forget that you're even arguing about a book, and it becomes, even though I think if I look back on it, I don't even want to say in 10 years, maybe in 6 months, I look back on the book that's finished, I'll be incredibly grateful to have it, because this, I mean, even though it's like a unique thing to have like a mother and a daughter, it's not that uncommon to have like such an intense relationship between a mother and a daughter. So I'm just lucky that I put it in a book. You know what I mean? But at the same time, during it, I think that was it was a really big challenge, but it made me learn a lot more about her, about each other, I think. And I wrote it when I was my personality changed the most. Like even from the beginning of the book to the end of writing it, once I hit the end, I would look back at stuff I'd written in the beginning and regretted it because I don't feel the same anymore. And it had only been like 9 months, maybe. Whereas I think for my mom, she might still feel the same because she's solid in how her beliefs and her parenting or whatever.
I mean, it's still a journey for us. We're not in a dead end yet, but of course, the growth chart is not zigzag, right? I mean, most of us already have established our baseline by the time you're in your mid-30s. It's not like this, but I think an adolescent is more like this, and they're much more vulnerable and much more easily affected by their peers. Too.
Absolutely. I think it's so special that you guys were able to talk about things that I think a lot of people might not talk about until they're adults, and that this book kind of pushed you guys to have maybe those conversations you might have waited to have till later. And so I just think that's such a gift. I'm so excited for you guys that you do have it.
And the reason why I think Viking was very interested in the book is that, in most mother-daughter books, it's really written by one person who writes, and usually it's about a daughter who is now grown up and who reflects back on her relationship with her mother. There's not a book that is not a young adult book, but like a normal general audience book like this one, where the child is still a child writing about it as it happens. So it's a lot more in present tense and more contemporaneous to her life than when you're 50 looking back on your relationship with your mother. So it has a very interesting juxtaposition of my section, which is much more reflective because of my age looking back, and hers, which is much more urgent because it's current.
Right. So Harlan, how has going through this process impacted your relationship with each other? I mean, I think it's kind of unsaid that it's implied in what you guys were saying, but how has this book and even having these conversations and your mom's experience with the Vietnam War shaped who you are?
Well, I think in terms of a relationship with my mother, like having my mom as a parent it meant that, I mean, even ever since I was really little, but especially now, every time I felt something that related to the relationship, it was always to the most extreme extent possible. Like if I was angry, I would be like infuriated. But if sometimes when I'm really happy and I think about how much I love her and I care about her, I cry. Like it's incredible, and it's strange because usually throughout like daily life, I'm I like to think I'm like a pretty like neutral, like stable person. I kind of like numbed out, but with my mother, everything is heightened. And then it was even more amplified again, like as I'm writing it, because it's such a personal thing. I get irritated when she goes over my homework and points out mistakes. So like imagine if she's pointing out things that I actually wrote that's like a creative thing that's about her, but I also think that when I was born, I actually do believe that like trauma can be passed down like generationally. It could be like a psychological thing, but we spent a lot of time together, and it's not just because she tells me about things that are like frightening and scary from things she's gone through, but also I think it's just almost like how twins feel it with each other. It could be a mother-daughter thing too, especially because I had a dad who was a lot older, so he was really only able to like fully parent up until I was about 9. And then he was still there, but my mother acted like mother and father almost a lot after that. And, you know, my dad was white. He was born in California. So it was almost like the Vietnamese side of me was diluted. So it's not that I felt this intense relationship because of the Vietnamese or the Vietnam War or something. I experienced both cultures, you know, like it was a blend. But my mom, for example, she goes, because of the things she learned throughout the war, her parenting is also very, like, it's very extreme. It's very, you know, it's unusual because she gives me a lot of freedom, you know, like if I say like, I just want, you know, it's not like other Asian moms, I guess, like tiger moms. I have friends who are full Vietnamese who aren't even allowed to leave their house, like mostly ever, like even without the virus before. And she's always given me a lot of social freedom. I think it's because she's like compensating for the fact that, you know, in high school, she wasn't able to do that as much. There was a lot of like racist people, a lot, like her teachers, her peers, just like, even when I think about it, I get really upset. So she's always let me have more freedom like that. But then at the same time, I always thought she was very overbearing, you know, with like everything, like a sweater on the chair, like explosion, you know, and then that's a huge argument, which goes into other things. So it's
not explosion.
And
it keeps happening.
Yeah, right. You got it, right? It's not the first time. Okay. And it's not about the sweater. It's about not being listened to, I'm sure. It's got nothing to do with the sweater. But, you know, I can see that it would be very intensive for her because, you know, like everybody says that education is important, right? I mean, if you meet any parent, they're going to say, yes, education is important. Because nobody's going to say education is not important. But what does it mean? What does it mean when you say education is important? Because of my experience, where education is your ticket to entry into American society and to not just survive, but to excel in American society, that becomes, and it becomes everything. And it's also, to me, it's because of my personal experience coming in here. We left Vietnam. You know, my parents and my family had all of their wealth in land, right, which is not portable. So we basically left everything for freedom. We didn't leave everything in order to run away from violence. It's for freedom, right? And the freedom here is very precious. And it's a personal relationship, meaning I have a personal relationship with freedom. It is not just something that John Locke or Jean-Jacques Rousseau or the founders wrote about, because we've left everything, going to a place where we don't know whether or not we're going to succeed in order to have freedom. It's not to have safety, because with freedom can also comes a lack of safety, right? Because you have the freedom to do things that may be harmful to you. But that is the freedom that is in a free society, because you're not having the paternalism of communism. Because communism is about, from the top down, you can do this, you can do that, and you cannot do this, you cannot do that. So it's not for safety, it's for freedom. And the freedom is, education gives you freedom because it gives you a critical mind. And I always tell Harlan, it doesn't even matter to me what you believe. I mean, I hope that my values are passed on to her, but what's critical is a critical mind, because I'm not trying to, it's not like I'm imparting propaganda to her. I say, whatever I say or whatever you read, look at the other side and then weigh whether or not you agree with this side or that side, but don't just imbibe and regurgitate, because then you're not free. You have to develop, through education, a critical thinking mind, like a First Amendment, freedom of conscience, freedom of thought, freedom of assembly, right? So education is important, and it's everything. And to me, if you work hard, if you are like, have no issues in terms of biological impediments, like, you know, some learning issue, if you just work hard and it's just one drop of water a day, right? My father always said, even the stone gets worn down by one drop of water a day. So it's all about effort. It's not about intelligence. so when I see, you know, like a child not putting in the effort, right, then it can be overpowering to her.
There's like a lot of pressure too, because I mean,
Pressure.
if your mom comes from Vietnam, okay, and she's like 13 and she doesn't speak English, and then she somehow still ends up going to Yale, and your dad, you know, like went to Stanford, and all of this, how could I possibly get anything less than an A on an English paper? Do you know what I mean? Like, when I have all the resources, I'm born here, I speak English, I'm given resources for tutors if I want them, you know, I go to school every day, no one is being racist against me, I have friends. So there's a lot of pressure, and it also means that I think it was hard for her to understand that like there would be a different standard, if that makes sense, because she was here and she did have to work really hard, as she said, like it was about like the water on the rock. Whereas I think from like when I was really little, even when I was in like martial arts or piano, I never practiced, and it would drive her crazy because I realized that I would put myself in things to begin with that I was really good at already. So like I had the choice to do it, if that makes sense. And then I wouldn't have to practice, and I'd realize I'd still kind of improve enough, and I always just kind of like skimmed by. So that already started a difference in our personalities, like clashing, because then going into school, and I saw a test, I don't know why I'm telling a teacher this, but I saw that there'd be a test in a week, and I wouldn't panic, I wouldn't think I should start studying. I just think like, I'll pay attention in class, and then when the test day comes, I should be fine. Whereas, you know, she wouldn't really be able to understand that kind of thinking, because she never had the chance to do that. She always had to, she first learned English, right? Like every night, I think she told me she put like a radio under her pillow that was speaking in English, and she'd absorb it. And she'd work hard. She went to the library every day. I never had to. So it causes a very big conflict, I think, with that. But at the same time, you know, I feel really lucky because I feel like you could recover from a war in two ways. You could either, you know, stay stagnant, or you could go the opposite extreme and go as far up as you can and educate yourself really well. And because she did that for herself and for her daughter, I learned so much about the world from such a young age. And I think even though maybe like a couple of years ago when I was a little more immature, I would have resented it, because it would mean like everything is a teachable moment. You know, like the dinner table, I wouldn't just be able to like talk about my day. We'd talk about something super intense like politics or like starvation or something. And it was always on, you know, education was always on. But then I realized like it's worth it, because even though it was all packed into those few years, by the time I reach 18, I'll have seen and heard a lot and had the privilege of learning so much that most people learn in their whole life, kind of. And it's all because she is my mom. So there's, you know, it's a double-edged sword, I think.
I love that. I can relate to a lot of that. My mom went through a lot as a child, and I think her constantly talking to me about it throughout my childhood implanted so much wisdom from the lessons she learned, that I didn't have to go through that myself, if that makes sense. I was able to, you know, learn from her experiences. And it sounds like that's the same with you guys. It sounds like you've been openly talking about, my mom had to fight through a lot of she was the only daughter and had 4 brothers. And so she was the traditional female. She had to do everything in the home, and she was not allowed to go to college. And she ended up getting kicked out of her house for going to college on her own will and paying for it herself. And that, so she taught me also that education is the key to, you know, opening a whole world. And also she immigrated here when she was 11. And so she spoke English as a second language from Norway. So she was 2 when the Nazis occupied Norway. And so all these things that she imparted to me, I think really transferred into my life. And I see that with you guys. I see a lot of parallels, even though it's completely different life experiences. I think it's a lot of the same, you know, the intent. My mom was very intense as well, because she had to fight so hard for everything. And so I learned to appreciate that from her experiences. So I appreciate you guys sharing. It's really cool. Harlan, what's your next steps? What are you doing after you graduate?
I'll
I decided to go to UCLA. It was really hard because I was kind of bound, like choosing like NYU or like USC or Berkeley. So but it was, it's hard because during the virus, you're already stressed out, and then you don't have all the resources you usually have to make the choice. Like normally I would have flown probably back out to New York and just looked around. The reason why I didn't go to NYU is because they don't have like an actual campus. Like it's just like buildings scattered throughout the village. So I wanted a shelter when I'm first going away from home. I'm gonna study probably like business economics or something like that, and then later on in graduate school, get an MBA, I think, because I really do want to do something with like a business foundation, but then on top, like layer it, I want to do film, so like film production company, like writing scripts. I think like even though I've always been into writing books because that's all I've really known, I really want to transition into like script writing and then screenplay, because like a book, especially the way I've always written, I really focus on like dialogue. The difference is like I think my mom is really into like descriptive like detail. She's a beautiful like writer with details and like describing scenes and stuff, like rice fields and like every emotion. She knows how to describe perfectly. And I always, I rush. So I've always been like more of like a dialogue writer, like to the point. And scripts are just it's a book, just the dialogue. And then you have a screenplay, like person who's in charge of screenplay and directing, and then they kind of decide like how to describe it with the movie, if that makes sense. So I might do that, and I would kind of want to move to Vancouver when I'm older, maybe. But I mean, I have like really big dreams, but obviously you need to get a job first. So if I have like the money, then I'd like to get a job where I can travel. I want to see a lot. My mom's already shown me a lot of the world, but I want to keep moving. I also get bored really easily, so I think I'm gonna have to move around a lot. Yeah.
So how has this quarantine impacted you guys?
I've been reflecting on this because the quarantine, it has had two effects on me. One, it unfortunately reminded me a little bit of the kind of subterranean angst that was very prevalent during the Tet Offensive. Because during the Tet Offensive, for the first time ever in a very long war, the people in the capital city were under siege, and there were curfews. So the shutdown, economic shutdown, felt as a matter of sort of like the gestalt of a curfew to me. And I haven't had that feeling since leaving in '75. So it's like a silent threat, the way a shark is in terms of being invisible, but you sort of know it's there. So it creates a tense, but it's not a tenseness that comes from like, let's say, an explosion, right? It's a tenseness that comes from a new dawn, that there is a weird new normalcy. So that's very similar to the Tet Offensive. Like for almost half a year, all of Saigon and all of the cities that were under siege were under curfew. So this is very similar to being under curfew to me. It's slightly less intense only because you don't get the feeling that the virus is strategically planning to get you in particular, whereas let's say a Viet Cong is in fact trying to get you in particular, right? So there is less of a degree of somebody planning to ambush you, but it's still that kind of feeling. The second feeling it has for me is it's actually not too bad for me, because aside from the curfew feeling and the tenseness, the underground sub rosa tenseness, right? Aside from that, I'm already an introvert, so I don't mind at all actually being at home. I mean, I'm a homebody. I never want to leave. I'm happy just staying at home. And so now everybody's at home, and it's okay. it affects me because Harlan now, because things are loosening up, she's leaving. And it makes me very nervous because, you know, to me, when things loosen up is when, I mean, just the science tells you things will spike, right? I mean, we're opening up because of the economy, not because the virus has been vanquished. So it's still there, but now everybody is less probably careful because when something becomes normal, you get used to it and you don't take the same precautions. So I'm always reminding her, you know, we disinfect the house, nobody enters this house at all. It's like a bubble. And when she leaves, I say, you know, you are leaving, and if you bring back the virus, that's a big problem. So that's where our issue is. And she's an extrovert, so she needs to leave.
Yeah, but the biggest mystery to me is how my mom, like, she parented really hard, and she's very, you know, she like very firm and everything. So it's really odd how I've realized through this crisis how different we are in handling things. Like, it's not that I don't care about it. I obviously don't want to get the virus or give it to my mom, or, you know, I mean, I heard that dogs, like, there's one dog who tested positive for, I don't want to give it to my dog. But for some reason, it's a concern, but I still, it never hit me. Does that make sense? Like, when it first started, it was never like super scary. It's similar to like my dad's death, for example. Like, when it happened, the first like few weeks, total numbness. Like, it doesn't even register.
Maybe hers is just a delayed reaction.
Yeah, it's just complete. And then, you know, it's not that I am trying to minimize it or I don't see it as something serious. Like, I disinfect with her every day. I listen to her daily news about how many people are dying. But, you know, I still think to myself, like, I'm still gonna go outside and walk. I'm still gonna go, I'm just gonna wear a mask. I'm gonna go to the beach all the time.
You do that.
Yeah, I'm still gonna go to the beach all the time. Like, but we always get into arguments because to her, I think it looks like I just don't seem to care about it. But actually, I think I just cope differently. Like, I cope by laughing. Even at funerals, I laugh sometimes. Really, it's bad. But, you know, it's just something that I do. I don't really want to deal with it face on. But also, like, staying together in the house, like, I started doing things I didn't really do before. Like, I painted something that was like a really big painting that I really like now. I've been doing more writing because I'm kind of working on like a second one that I might be doing by myself. So I've kind of
She has 200 pages already.
Wow.
The book, yeah.
And
That's
being
awesome.
apart from like all my friends and like the social pressures, I guess, has made me sit and really think about different relationships beyond like my family relationships too. Because this book, the first book that we wrote together, was a lot about just the family. And now that I think I'm like done with high school, I have a lot to say about like the social parts and just like things with my friends, or, you know, a lot of books that are actually like maybe your favorites. If you really think about it, they're kind of like ordinary stories, you know, but they're just written in a very special way. So that's what I'm also trying to like find my own style of writing and like a different voice. So the quarantine has helped me do a lot of thinking.
You've read some books?
Yeah, and we haven't been fighting as much as I thought we would. Like, it's actually less than when I'm out more, I think, when we do other things. I don't know why that is. I mean, the house is like, it's big enough to where I can like go and not see her if I don't want to. But we actually have like a good routine. It's pretty calm. It's weird because now that I feel things reopening, I almost feel nervous that they're reopening. You know, like, I'm not sure what they're gonna be like. And also, I'm really sad that the time with high school was cut short. Like, that's 3 months shaved off. But at the same time, like, when I look back from that point, it doesn't feel like it's been 2 months at all. Like, it feels like probably like 3 weeks, actually. So.
Yeah, I totally agree. It went by really fast. I can't believe that next week or the week after next is graduation. That's just mind-boggling.
And I don't feel like I should be graduating. Like, I still feel like a baby all the time. Like, I don't feel 18 at all. Like,
You're not 18 yet.
I'm almost 18. And when I was like 5 or 6, I had this girl who was babysitting me, and she was 15. Or I'd have like camp counselors who were 18. They seemed so old, and like they figured it out, you know, like teenagers and everything. And I still feel the same as I did at that time when I was little. and I don't feel like how I thought I would at all. So I feel kind of rushed, weirdly, even though I thought it was going slowly. It really didn't.
Because they're not going through the ritual markers. You know, like normally you have, you know, I mean, all societies have rituals for a reason, and even animals like the elephants, they even have a ritual, let's say for the death of their matriarch. So when you rip away a ritual, which marks a rite of passage, you know, like this is my high school graduation ceremony. You're pulling the rug out from them in a way that is more than it just, oh, you didn't have a ceremony. You're sort of throwing them into the post-high school world without a kind of sufficient armor and celebration, which is what a ritual is for, right? So it's you may do it by yourself, let's say in your own house, but there's something very nice, you know, about a collective act, right? Like this is high school graduation and everybody is doing it together. So like for me, when I always prefer to go to the ballot and actually vote, I like standing in line and being there with other people, because it feels like you're participating in democracy when you're out there in a public space doing it. And to me, the graduation is like that common rite of passage where you're all in this public space together. So when they don't have that, I think it takes away, you know, it's like suddenly, you know, like if you're in a four-season state and you have spring and then you never had summer, you know, never had autumn, you know, those markers become reliable markers for a lot of the students. So I think it's sad that they don't have it, you know?
Yeah.
And I think that's moody without realizing the reason. You know, like I kind of angry, and sometimes now I go through, it could be just like the hormones, as my mom said, but I go through like these like very like big mood swings now, especially because I don't have like the bustle of school every day to distract me. You know, like I'm kind of quiet by myself. Everything feels very quiet in my head. So, and I think that is something that we have in common a lot. We are like very sensitive to like, I mean, my mom's more adaptable, I think, than I am, but we are very sensitive in like our moods. Like our heads are pretty quiet now that quarantine has happened. And I'm actually still really surprised about how we've handled it, because maybe it'd be different if we were still actively writing the book right now during quarantine.
Our book is in production.
Yeah, but it's in production right now, so we're not like writing anything. We're each doing our own creative stuff, so it's probably better.
Well, I just want to thank you so much for sharing your lives with us for this short time. And I hope you guys have a good day, the rest of your day, but also especially to your future. Thank you, Harlan.
Thank you. And thank you for being our teacher.
Yeah, I miss going to class.